right. Thank you, John. So I am really pleased to be, again, Jeanette. In person is amazing. I was so happy to see you and give you a big hug, which we can now do, and it's not too weird. Really just be able to kind of get, I realized I was telling Stephanie on the panel, I'm like, I remember how much I really like people. So it was really nice to get the invite to be able to come here today and be part of this. And I realized that we were joking earlier, I'm, sort of the John sandwich. I'm going to introduce John in a minute, and John introduced me. I'm the unnecessary link in the supply chain, is what I've discovered, but that's okay. So I have a really, a great opportunity just to talk for a second about Exeger and what we do. So, but before I do that, Jeanette, I just want to say thank you for really amazingly relevant and powerful remarks. I always love hearing you speak, and I'm just so grateful that you're still on that side of the fight as I'm trying to contribute now from the other side of the fence. My background, I was the director of counterintelligence and security. I'm an NCSC alum, and I was the head of counterintelligence security for DoD. And really, spent the last decade of my career fighting the same fight you're still fighting. So thank you for your remarks. As I was listening to you and looking up at the beautiful mural, it's amazing how, when you work in this mission space, and everyone in this room is very, very enlightened, but you can't look at a mural like that without seeing China and Russia, right? Does everybody see what I see, right? China buying up our farmland, that's Middle America. It's a beautiful thing. That's the country and the nation that we love, and we have all dedicated our lives to protecting and serving and defending it. And yet it is under attack every day, right? So you see the farmland, you see China, disrupting critical infrastructure, our food supply. You see them buying up wind farms up there somewhere. Why are they doing that? They're buying up wind farms to disrupt our energy supply, to have placement and access to military bases. They are disrupting our water supply. They're messing with our electrical grid. At the third tier, below our bulk power system, China owns 32% of the transmitters, right? So, I mean, this is why supply chain is not, it impacts everything. And the good news is, I think, never would have happened without COVID, but 2 years later, there's an awareness in Middle America about why this matters and why it is an everyday, every American problem, and not just Americans, but our closest partners and allies from a NATO and UN standpoint. So the world has changed quickly. Everyone knows that. And I think, we are all obviously still contributing to just the awareness piece. And really at Exeger, what we do is we help our clients with that step one, knowing who you're even doing business with, who is in your ecosystem. That is honestly, the hardest part. Because when you get below that first tier of your directly connected third parties, whether they're people or companies, you don't really know what's going on below. And yet our adversaries have spent a lot of time understanding what's going on below that, just for the defense industrial base, I call it the weak underbelly, right? They know exactly how to exploit that supply chain and what vectors to take advantage of. And if they can't get it one way, they'll find 3 or 4 other ways. You talked about the wheel of death, which I loved. All the different ways our adversaries exploit our supply chains to get after whatever piece of IP technology and that they need to gain a competitive advantage. So that really, resonated with me. I mean, I really appreciate your remarks, Jeanette. And the first step is the illumination and awareness of who you're doing business with. And then we really take leveraging AI, because you have to bring technology to this fight. The complexity, scale, scope of the problem is too vast. If you don't bring technology to the fight, you will not ever get a handle on it. And so we bring artificial intelligence software. When I first saw it, I was the deputy director of DCSA, agency I created. And it was really the most exciting and powerful software I had seen, and piece of AI I had seen. And so it compelled me to come out and to be part of bringing this technology to the fight. And I have to say, INSA is really the reason I had the confidence to do that, because it made me believe in the value of public-private partnership. So that's what we do when we think about cyber as one type of operational risk, right? Holistically, cyber is a very, very important threat vector to focus on, but it's just one. It's one of many types of risks and threats that our adversaries expose. So we've got operational risk, financial health, foci, reputational, criminal, and regulatory. And really, again, once you can understand that, then you can start to mitigate. The mitigation is the key, right, Jeanette? That is absolutely where we are now, trying to help our clients actually, now that you know who's in your ecosystem, where all the risk is, get after mitigating it. And don't just do it for your organization, do it, share it, right? Share that risk across the entire federal government into the defense industrial base with those OEMs who really have to take ownership of that problem for an acquisition use case and clean up their sub-tier supply. So, that's a little bit about what we do, but really my job here is to introduce this fine gentleman to my left, John Dillard, who is a long-standing colleague of mine and friend. I was his client for quite some time on the DoD side when we were working on another little problem that actually was the first 10 years of my federal career, reforming the security clearance process. So we spent a lot of quality time together moving and transforming the clearance process to continuous evaluation model. And they really were our trusted colleagues at a company called Big Sky that John used to own. I don't think you are there anymore. You're not associated with them anymore, right? But it was an amazing company with amazing people. In fact, one of his employees from Big Sky is now my senior vice president for operations at Exeter. So he had amazing people. He is actually now, though, the CEO of Threatswitch. We are a client of John's, and so I can, say with confidence he's got a good technology. It's a cloud-based software platform that helps clear contractors build and maintain compliance security programs, everything from NISPOM to CMMC and well beyond. So I can attest to the validity of what he does and the technology that he offers to the defense industrial base and commercial clients in the federal government. John started his career at the CIA. I didn't actually know this about you until somebody wrote it in my notes here. And he was an analyst and a graduate fellow focused on nuclear proliferation and nuclear security. In his 20-plus career, and I always do that too, 20-plus, because I don't really want you to know how many years it's been. 20-plus year career in security and intelligence includes time as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve and a stint as an FSO. And I mentioned Big Sky, again, wonderful partners, again, made me believe in public-private partnership, things like that. So, John, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce a very esteemed panel that I look forward to hearing from.
Excellent. Thank you, Carrie. That was a very generous introduction. Really appreciate it. And I'm excited about this problem. I'm excited to be here in person because, as Carrie mentioned, I build software for a living. So nobody's more interested in this than I am because it affects me directly. And I have an incredible panel that I get to talk to today for you guys in person, which seems a little strange. We talked about this beforehand, but we're going to look very natural as if we do this all the time, even though we use Zoom most of our lives for the last 2 years. So to my immediate left, I have Dr. Allan Friedman, who is Senior Advisor and Strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Janice Haith. Haith, did I get that right, Janice? Is it Haith or Haith? Haith is good? All right. Strategic Client Executive for Oracle Public Sector. Mark Hakun, Principal Director for Cybersecurity of the Office of CIO at DoD, and Stephanie Kiel, Senior Manager, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google, but as we noted earlier, far more importantly, a former INSA intern. So good things happen to INSA interns. You too could be a panelist one day, guys. This is awesome. So I want to jump in and let these guys introduce themselves a little bit and explain how their roles tied to cybersecurity, the security, software security supply chain. And anything else about the problem that you're particularly excited about that we'll certainly dig into. So take 60 seconds. We'll start with you, Allan. We'll go around the horn so these guys know where you're coming from.
So I'm Allan. I'm primarily known in DC as the guy who won't shut up about SBOM. So we've talked about this a little bit today. An SBOM is essentially a list of ingredients for software. You go to the store, you buy a Twinkie. It comes with a list of ingredients. Why on earth don't we expect that bare minimum amount of transparency for the software that runs our critical infrastructure, that supports our government, and of course supports our intelligence community? Building that out has been a fun challenge because it's not something we can do unilaterally. We all use the same underlying software, and so it needed to be a global effort. And we've made a lot of progress. There's still a lot more work to do. And it's, of course, been a key feature of last year's executive order that I'm sure we're going to talk about.
We will. We're going to talk about both. Mark.
Mark Hakun. I'm the long title, but Deputy CISA for DoD. Interested in here because a lot of our job is making sure, from a CISO standpoint, people do what they're supposed to go do. And if they do that, they shouldn't get in trouble. So one of those things they got to do is update their software and do the right patching. But now if they're doing that, they're getting in trouble. So we want to make sure we take that variable out and make sure the software supply chain, when people do what they're supposed to do, they don't get penalized for doing that. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm interested in getting the software development processes right and secure from the beginning of the process, not at the end where people, oh, I got a patch. So let's get it right from the beginning. So that's my area of interest.
Yes.
Okay, so I am responsible for Navy Marine Corps since I'm the former Navy CIO. And part of my concern, or part of our concern, is how do we find some balance in ensuring that the services all are playing on the same field, there's some reciprocity, so to speak, and that the overall cost impacts are not significant to both the government or to our company. And then our partners that we deal with, since we're an OEM, we deal with a lot of systems integrators, and we want to make sure that we're balanced in how we do this.
Excellent. Stephanie.
Thanks. I am the former INSA intern, so for all my INSA interns out there, keep working hard. INSA was a big part of actually my start in the federal government about 10, 11 years ago, and so without this organization, I might not be sitting here today. So I'm currently at Google serving as a senior manager for government affairs and public policy, working across Google teams to contribute to our role in terms of software security from a government affairs perspective specifically. So that requires partnering with technical engineers, product managers, et cetera, working to promote what Google is doing to implement parts of the executive order as well. So I also have the fortune to have come from a team at the NSC that had put the EO together. So I'm fortunate to be able to bring that perspective as well. And if I could be so bold to presume to speak to industry after just a short time at Google, I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, panelists. We talked beforehand, I think the right place to start in our conversation is the executive order. It's a frame by which we can have this conversation, which is amazing. And Mark, I thought I'd start with you in understanding where DoD is in the implementation of the executive order and your thoughts on how it changes stuff. So
In the department, as it is all in your organizations, it starts with top-down leadership. So the executive order can't get any higher than that. Executive order directs us to go certain things, in this case relative to the software supply chain. Then inside the department, need to have that strategy, again, identified and supported by DoD leadership. So in early February, the Deputy Secretary did sign out the software modernization strategy, put some guide rails around what we want to do and how we want to develop software across the department. We have a lot of innovators across the department, but you still need certain guide rails to go what environments are you developing on? So software containerization, what is that underlying infrastructure that you're developing on? Looking at the cybersecurity of what you're developing, making sure those processes are baked in when you're developing that software right at the beginning. You are thinking about the cybersecurity constraints of what you're allowed to do, what you're allowed not to do. How does that integrate with cybersecurity operations or mission operations as well? Laying those out, and then best practice for DevSecOps for the developers. So laying all those out, and of course, down underneath the Deputy Secretary's strategy is all the series of manuals and policies within inside the department, making sure we're getting all those right. So the executive order really focused the laser beam inside the department to go get our policies, procedures, processes in order to go run the whole DevSecOps pipeline, encourage that innovation, but do it under certain constraints so we all know if somebody's using open source software, or somebody's using software from industry or government developed software, using a certain set of standards, and we can use that reciprocity, using it from one system to another and know what we're getting. So it really forced us to look at that from a whole governance standpoint, top down. The definitions for what was critical, again, helps us focus on what software we need to focus first, what critical systems are in place. Software bill of materials, I'll let you talk to that, but that's a new concept within inside the department. But we've long, with the acquisition community, put down a list of what we're buying, the hardware bill of materials. I think we'll talk on that later, but how do we define a software bill of materials across what the acquisition community, working with our acquisition sustainment group, how do we tell them what to contract for? What do we want it to look like? Get those standards, not only across the department, working with NIST, across the whole federal government. Getting those standards in place, getting those processes so we know what we're buying, and what other people are using, and it's standard across, and while taking out as many variables as we possibly can, but allowing that room for innovation.
Excellent. Excellent, good stuff. And Janice and Stephanie, Janice, maybe I'll start with you on this one. I mean, industry always receives EOs a little differently than the government does, of course, because that guy is not exactly our boss. So what is industry's take on the order, Janice, in terms of how it's being received at Oracle, and then Stephanie, would love for you to chime in on the same.
So we've actually embraced it. We've been baking in security right at the onset of all of our product development, and as an OEM, that's very important to us. I think where we see challenges is how do we balance that with our government customers and our private sector customers. We have a large number of private sector customers that don't follow the federal executive orders. I think, too, one of the things that we're looking at we've started an internal group looking at how do we do the security, and how do we continue to provide like the software bill of materials and things for products that we deliver to our tactical platforms. The Navy has ships, Air Force has planes, there's tanks, all of those things where we provide some level of a software code. How do we continue to do that when it's evolving and make sure that we get the appropriate patches and things in place? And then we have a lot of smaller vendors. And so what's the impact? How do we embrace them? And with that, we're participating in the Open Security Software Forum. We're involved with industry trade groups, but we want to see a balanced approach that if we do this for Navy and Marine Corps, this is the way they want it. It's no different than when we go to the Air Force or the Coast Guard or whoever, because that's when we start to see the breakdown, and that's when we see the challenges coming up. And I also think one of the concerns that we have, well, I have more so probably because I came from the government, is how fast is DOD going to get the other DOD, secretaries in OSD, such as AT&L, whatever, to implement in those policies and procedures. So when is the 5,000 going to be updated? Is it being updated? Where are those aspects coming? So those are the things that we're looking at and concerned with.
Excellent. Stephanie?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say from what I've seen, again, in a fairly short time, Google has certainly embraced the EO as a welcome step by the administration to really invest in a positive step change for the country in terms of cybersecurity. So we're looking forward to continuing to contribute to follow-on conversations. I think the focus on these issues has been helpful, particularly the recognition that a true partnership between government and industry on these topics is really critical. So we've been grateful to see industry included in so many of the conversations in the development of the EO, as well as the follow-on steps and requirements. So I think generally positive, and I think as these conversations continue to evolve and we see potentially additional requirements come out, we're looking forward to contributing.
Excellent. Well, and my reading of the EO, what I was very pleased to see, is very cloud-first, cloud-centric in terms of encouraging agency adoption. And Allan, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on whether the EO applies differently to the cloud applications that we're procuring versus on-prem solutions, or what is your take on the cloud component of the EO?
So first, in terms of the high-level EO, it begins by saying that the trust we place on our software should be proportional to the trust and trustworthiness and transparency of that software. So it's a great framing, because one of the core distinctions of something that's on my network versus something that's on someone else's network is what level of visibility we have. Section 4 of the EO, which is around the secure development, which is where all of these requirements are that NIST has been working on, and we need to sort of turn this into the application. There was some confusion, because at first everyone said, well, we're just going to focus on on-prem because that's the high priority. Remember, the EO could be seen as in part a response to SolarWinds, which introduced a lot of risk from on-prem data leakage. The White House clarified to say, no, this does in fact apply to all software. And so one of the challenges we're working on is sort of understanding what that looks like. One of the steps of the EO was after we had sort of defined some of the basics through NIST, was OMB is writing some rules. And CISA helped support that process of having some public transparency, some engagement. We asked for comments. Now, I don't know how many of you have been involved in a FedRAMP process before. It's not necessarily the most popular government program out there. However, I think it's really important to note that one of the most popular themes we heard from industry and from agencies as well, from agency CIOs, was, hey, if you're going to do something around cloud, build on FedRAMP, don't create a brand new process. I, of course, can't speak to what OMB is going to come up with, but as they roll out sort of a phased model, one of the things that we're strongly trying to do is say, let's build on what we have while introducing new security capabilities.
Excellent. And I'd like to pull the thread on software development practices a little bit and really start with our industry folks. Aside from the executive order, for Oracle and Google, and Stephanie, maybe I'll start with you on this one. For Google, what does good software supply chain security mean? How does it affect secure coding? How does it affect SecDevOps? What does it mean to have those good practices for Google?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think, as we've discussed earlier here today, it's 100% foundational. In terms of the software supply chain, one of our key efforts alongside other industry partners has been development of what we call the CISA framework, which stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts. So I'll touch on that a little bit more later in the conversation. There are also a lot of great resources online, but essentially it's a framework that allows for a better understanding of the integrity of the software supply chain from levels 1 through 4, and it gives a really helpful mechanism for evaluating the integrity of the chain. So we're looking forward to continue developing that. Generally speaking, as Janice said, we also bake in security from the beginning in all of our products. It's something that we're really focused on. This has been central to our product strategy for a really long time. We also pioneered the concept of zero trust architecture, applying zero trust approach to most aspects of our own operations and building in layers of defense, assuming that not every malicious activity, such as attempts to gain user credentials, will be defeated. So those together are some of the really key aspects that, in terms of how we approach the topic.
Excellent. And Janice, I mean, we talk about putting security first, and it's not just in terms of priority. It's literally talk about it in the first conversation. How does Oracle do that and build in security at the outset?
So Oracle continues security all the time. It's a 24/7 thing. We have dedicated teams both on the commercial and government side that look at it. For instance, we've been analyzing what happened with the Colonial Pipeline incident, the solar winds, all of those. We rely on the information that the government provides to tell us where the flaws were, where were the problems. We hire separate independent companies to do a validation constantly, test and evaluate what we've developed, what have our suppliers developed, what's going on in the overall environment, what do we see in the future, where's the threat. We know where the threat actors are for what we can find out from the government, but I think we look at it from, people are more sophisticated. It was interesting that Jeanette mentioned the volunteers. I mean, the younger people out here, they are very savvy with computers and software code. So we're trying to bring that mindset into. We have a robust team that looks at this all the time. And I think what we're concerned about would be long-term, again, is not just standardization, but more so on the tactical side for DoD than anything else, the platforms. Because you can't just make those changes on platforms like that. It takes, Mark and Allan know too, it takes time. And being from the Navy, we used to say, we can't turn a ship on a dime. If you think the Navy could implement a cybersecurity change that fast, it just can't. It just can't. And if they're deployed, it's even harder. So how do we make this more agile for the tactical environment?
And Mark, I mean, in getting at how, Allan mentioned the NIST software development framework and other mechanisms to propagate these standards into how people actually do business in the private sector. How does DoD assist with that over time in terms of turning these things into frameworks that people can follow?
Well, as with Janice, I have a Navy background as well, so I can relate, obviously, to the turning a ship on a dime. But getting the development process, getting it as far up front as possible, making sure those standards are known, so when it is deployed, you can minimize how much you actually have to go back. We all know there's going to be capability development, capability needs, but trying to get the process and standards up front in that acquisition, writing the contract right, writing the testing for all that right up front prior to actually trying to go deploy. We're very good in the department about having a long process to go look at that, but let's take advantage of that process and the rules that are in place to go get the software right up front with allowing innovation in the backside, but don't give yourselves capabilities that can't be tested and churn, even though it's a good idea. Make sure you have a thoughtful process about it and keep that, and be rigorous about enforcing that as well.
Excellent. I want to pick up the innovation theme a little bit, and for certainly Google and Oracle and many other large companies, a big part of the innovation strategy is acquiring and nurturing and procuring software components from small tech startups that are driving innovation in the economy. How does the EO and supply chain software security affect these very, very small companies that in many cases you guys might be buying them and then deploying them into your environments, or they're delivering their services through your cloud infrastructure, sometimes directly to the federal government or others. So Stephanie, what are your thoughts on how all of this affects small companies that are really that engine of innovation, but it may not have the resources to do all this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think recognizing the challenges that might be inherent in some of these steps for small businesses is really important. There's a lot that we can do as large companies to partner with smaller enterprises to sort of, continue to drive the cybersecurity processes. But a lot of these steps are pretty resource intensive, so I think partnership is really the key there. There are steps that we as larger companies can take alongside government to help things along as well. But it's a good thing to be mindful of as we continue these conversations across government and industry on topics like this. I mentioned previously Google's commitment to security, so that would certainly come into play as we're acquiring smaller entities as well, bringing them into the fold in terms of how we do things for secure software development and folding them into our processes and so forth. But it is a really key aspect to keep in mind.
Excellent. And pivoting to Allan real quick and we're going to talk more about bills of material shortly. But if you think about these small companies that Stephanie's talking about, how do they interact with the bill of material process, the way that it's being rolled out in a way that it manages the complexity for them, but still allows them to participate what the government and large vendors need?
I think many of the security requirements that are called for in the executive order actually are quite rare in security in that they provide a natural advantage for smaller businesses compared to larger businesses. So think about how many different vertical families there are in a large company, a manufacturer. Or think about how custom and bespoke the build pipeline is. I won't pick on either of these two companies, so we'll say Microsoft, right? They have developed a customized model of development. There's nothing special or better or worse about it, but it's very unique to them. So any change they're going to make is going to have to be inherent around that. Whereas today, a small company that's selling a software product is almost certainly going to be cloud native, be using COTS, CICD, right, continuous integration, continuous deployment, if they are in fact a DevOps organization. And so a lot of the tools that are called for, do you have a static analysis tool? Well, yeah, it came with Jenkins, right? It's something that folds in. Can you produce an SBOM? It's 2 commands in your build pipeline. It's much, much easier for smaller organizations to do a lot of this basic stuff. And I think to the credit of the executive order authors, this is by intention. It's saying this is stuff that every good modern organization should be doing. And guess what? Large organizations that have invested a lot in lobbying, you're also going to have to make sure that you can produce these types of requirements, these types of artifacts.
Excellent. And I want to keep talking about bills of material a little bit more because we may have jumped ahead a little bit. Explain to this audience, not everybody might know, what the heck is a software bill of material? Why is it good? What are we going to be doing with them?
So I think most of us are aware that software is not hewn out of alabaster marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands. It's not written anymore, it's assembled. And it's assembled out of pieces that we buy and, of course, pieces that we use from the open source community. This isn't necessarily better or worse. I'd actually argue it probably is better. But the challenge is it means that when you have something on your network, you've got, say, I don't know, a satellite downlink, the risk may not be that the bad guy is going to be looking at that piece, that box, of which maybe there are 5,000 on the entire planet. The risk is going to be that they have found that it uses an out-of-date crypto library, which in turn exposes all of the traffic in clear text if they know what to do. And so the value to the owner of that organization is to say, let me know not just this blinking box that's made by Rest & Co. It's what's under the hood, opening up that black box of software and making it transparent. Now, this by itself doesn't protect us at all. Right? Having that level of data doesn't protect us at all, any more than having a list of ingredients on a Twinkie will help keep you on a diet, help protect your family from allergens, or help you have a food-based lifestyle. Right? The list of ingredients won't automatically do any of those, but good luck trying to do any of those without that list of ingredients. So an SBOM is very much the same thing. It is a necessary data layer on top of which we're going to be able to build a lot of power. Now the basic story, to wrap up here, the basic story is just known vulnerabilities, right? Hey, and of course we have the great example of Log4j, right? An SBOM is absolutely essential if you want to quickly and easily understand, am I affected by this thing that we now need to worry about? But of course, it can enable so much more, whether it's processing information from your friends in the secret squirrels, or actually setting up a more organized surveillance campaign to make sure that your open source components aren't being compromised. Rather than just saying, well, we can't touch this because someone who has this kind of passport might have once looked at this line of code. That is simply not a very sustainable way to build a software model, and newer, better software is almost always more secure than older software.
Got it.
And so
that's great. Excellent overview. Thank you. Mark, how does DoD view SBOMs? How is it, and what are you borrowing from? I mean, obviously DoD's been using bills of material for stuff for ages. How do you view it differently, and how's the department adopting it?
The hardware bill of material, the nomenclature, the serial number, the software version on that, we've done for a long time to find that by the DFARS and the contracts, so we know standard across the department how to produce that. What we don't have is the recipe underneath that software bill of material. It's more than just a software version, right? You want to know where it was built, where it came from, when it was last updated, when it was patched, whatever, all that, the whole DNA of that software underneath the hood, underneath that surfer, what does that mean? Now, DoD, like through our DFARS process, can identify certain things, but it's much better to go do that in open source with the whole community, with the rest of the federal government, with industry, with the people developing open software. So we all using the same terminology, because it's going to help us to understand all if something else does happen. Version A and version A are the same. If you say version A, make sure it's the same, make sure we use the same language as much as we can. So it's much better to develop in partnership with the whole community, not just a DoD-centric development process for what an SBOM actually means. So again, talk about guidelines and processes earlier. Again, working with NIST, working with CISA, working with the industry to go define those across the department and how we use them is paramount.
Excellent. And Janice, the cloud version of this, right, which, obviously cloud software is usually deployed continuously. It's not like it's patched every 6 months or whatever it is, constantly interacting with other applications via APIs. How does industry view, or Oracle specifically view, software bills of material as it relates to cloud products and services? And is that different, and how should we think about it?
So we actually have been doing those for a while, particularly with our commercial customers, and I think that we view it as it's necessary because it does do what Mark said. It allows you to do the traceability of the products that are in your environment, and if there was an issue, you may be able to attack it sooner. But we consider this integral to what we do. It's something that we just want some standardization. But I think that overall, in the long term, I think we're all better off with it. And I think we can embrace it so that it is dynamic. In the on-prem environments, I would say we still do that. But what we do is we layer on, if we don't control the on-prem environment, we have to layer on what the owner of the manager of the on-prem environment does. We do that with them. But if it's in our environment, it's constant. It's nothing different. 24/7, we just keep updating it, and here's version, whatever the version is. So it's a good thing. I think we view it as a good thing and nothing that should go away. I think the executive order has actually helped move this along where we think it needs to be.
And Stephanie, is it similar for Google?
Yeah, it is. And I would also add Allan, to your point about SBOM being a really important starting point, that critical piece to understand what's under the hood, but that is just one part of the journey. There are other really helpful aspects that the executive order sets out in terms of vulnerability disclosure processes, incident response process improvement, and other steps that are necessary, other pieces to this puzzle as well. So we're encouraged to see the momentum that the executive order has put behind a helpful tool like SBOM, and looking forward to building on that with some of these other necessary pieces as well.
Awesome. And the reason why we have these things, and you touched on this, is in no small extent simply to eliminate the problem. Like let's see what's going on in our supply chain, so we can see, so we know what's going on. Mark, how does DoD view SBOMs and other practices adjacent to that as contributing to eliminating supply chains for software? And what are your expectations as a department for that?
So getting back to knowing what the pedigree is, all software is operated on some operational network. So having command and control of those structures, the commander, in this case, Cyber Command, Joint Force Headquarters, DODIN, working with our federal partners at CISA, they can command and control that network, knowing what software is on what versions. When somebody has software X running here and there's a vulnerability there, they can go target those area of operations. You have the software, report back to me in a certain period of time, send out cyber tasking orders, and report back. So having that hierarchy and pedigree across the services and agencies with the detailed knowledge of what software you have running allows us to operate much more effectively and efficiently in cyberspace, given that underlying infrastructure.
Excellent. And Allan, same question, really. I mean, what the expectation? Obviously, you're not just building a list for the fun of it, right? The point is to shine a light. I mean, that's when we say illumination, that's what we mean. So how does that translate for you, and how's that different for how we might view manufactured goods and illumination specifically as it relates to threats and risks?
So the good news is this is actually an easier problem for software because, right, I can take the hash of a component and say, okay, Mark's team did some of the work to figure out this is the pedigree, this is the provenance, this is now a trusted thing, and then everyone else in the entire organization who's using that same piece of software can verify that it hasn't been tampered. You can't take a hash of a DIM. You can't take a hash of a chipset. So our friends in the hardware world have actually a much harder problem tracking a lot of the hardware side. However, using this data still requires that most onerous and boring and important part of all cybersecurity, which is data management and plumbing. Right? It's one thing to say we've built the tool, we've got the standard, we've got industry buy-in, but now we actually have to manage the data. And this is something that, as we look forward to it, the executive order did not expressly say. It said, it stops at the time when the agency head gets the metadata, right? And again, to Stephanie's point, not just SBOM data, but the static and analysis testing data, the attestations that I have multi-factor authentication in my dev environment. There's a lot of great stuff in there. How we're going to manage that is going to be one of the next big steps. We all know that agency CIOs and CISOs have a lot on their plate. My colleagues at CISA keep giving them more to do. As well they should, right? We need to move quite quickly to fortify the chain. But we're going to work, the next step is to say, how do we manage this? And one of the challenges is, I think, how do we make sure that government doesn't spend 6 years building a solution that industry doesn't have today, but will have in 2 years? And so that's going to be something we're working with today, is the industry of how do we actually consume this data and turn data into intelligence, into action.
Awesome. All right, one more question for the panel before we go to Q&A. And this one, is to put a bookend on our conversation. We're doing all this stuff so that nothing bad happens. Bad stuff's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen anyway. So that brings us to incident response and recovery. And as we all know, you never do it by yourself. And so, Stephanie, I'll start with you on this one. How does Google view partnership in its supply chain and with government and with other stakeholders when incidents occur? What are the ingredients of successful working relationships, and how do we build those in advance so that we're not figuring it out while the incident's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a former role, I was also at CISA, and so it's really great to hear a shout out for the JCDC earlier. For us, that has been a really helpful mechanism for evolving our internal conversations about how we share this information, how we engage for the broader ecosystem in that manner. We have, of course, our own Security Operations Center, various teams that are responsible for responding to incidents when they do happen. We have a lot of resilience and redundancy in our system for when incidents do occur. But I think one of the key pieces is that mechanism for sharing information and how we evolve to make sure that we're sharing in a way that is helpful to operational network defenders. And that includes, CISA's further on partnerships with other international partners who have similar centers and similar setups. So as the JCDC continues to mature, we're really looking forward to leveraging that mechanism. We're happy to be able to contribute to the product that Jeanette mentioned earlier, alongside our Five Eyes partners and other industry partners who contributed. And tools like that, I think, are really helpful along this journey as we continue to evolve in this manner.
Excellent. And Janice, I mean, obviously sharing, as Stephanie described, is something we should be doing because it's a good idea. We also have an obligation to report certain things to CISA, among other places. How is Oracle adapting to the reporting requirements, especially some of the new guidelines
So we believe we've adapted well and will continue to adapt well to the requirements. I think that the industry-government partnership is absolutely essential. And it's like Stephanie said, the sharing of information is essential. So the more information we can get and the more we can provide back to the appropriate government entity, it will help move this process along and actually help improve the overall cyber defense long term, because information sharing is essential. I think too what we're seeing is that internally we've developed some internal teams that look at both our product lines and what's going on with the other incidents. And there are a lot of incidents that don't even make the news that we find out about. Everybody finds out about them at some point. And what did they do? What did they not do? Do some trace backs to what happened, and what can you do to prevent it in the future? Some of it is also people, and you have to look at, did we educate our people right? Are we doing the right things with our people? What else can we do? And so it's again, I'd say this is a constant and evolving requirement and activity, and partnership with CISA and other entities, DoD, all are integral to how we make this the right solution at the end of the day.
Excellent. And Mark, I mean, I'm sure we learned a ton from SolarWinds and Colonial, among other things. Is the reporting requirement set enough, or is there also a collaboration gap for just standard working relationships between government and industry that also needs to be addressed?
Well, we have stepped up since the executive order too. I mean, just some interest sharing with government as well. There's more formal relationships with CISA. We have people on the watch floor. We have certain responsibilities inside a defense industrial base where we interface with those companies and share data bilaterally or up and down the chain. So those processes are getting strengthened through the executive order and through existing DoD processes. Sharing those with CISA and what does CISA need to understand from a whole of government standpoint to know where it's affecting DoD or not, having people on the watch floors, making sure those processes are ironed out, and again, having the common lexicon, knowing when some incident in company A or government agency B, how we can translate that and get a broader site picture and know what's happening total across the whole cyberspace inside our collective infrastructures. I think it's paramount, but the executive order allowed us to push that ball further down the football field.
Got it. And Allan, when those reports come in, via collaboration or formal reporting channels, I mean, what happens? What's CISA's approach to managing what I'm sure is an increasing volume, and how does that help?
This is where I have to beg and say that I've been at CISA for 6 months and have not been very closely involved on exactly that incident side of the house. One thing I do want to flag, if folks didn't see it, and this was also created in the executive order, is the Cybersecurity Review Board. And this is something that has been kicking around the InfoSec research community for a while, including some good friends of mine who sort of been saying, hey, when a plane crashes, we have the National Transportation Safety Board, which doesn't go around and say, whose fault is it? We're going to punish someone. No, the goal is to say, how do we make sure that there's never a plane crash with these root causes again?
Right.
And the Cyber Safety Review Board has a model to do not just taking the incident response idea for the short-term stuff, but to turn around and say, this is something that we need to make sure we have lessons that are built and baked into the ecosystem.
Excellent. All right. So we've gotten a good overview, and I've got a list of questions in my hand, so I'm sure There'll be some meaty ones here, and we'll run out of time, I'm sure, at some point. But let's jump in. So Janice mentioned standardization a number of times. I mean, we've all talked about that a little bit. And specifically for Allan and Mark, and I'll pick on Mark first. How about that? How are your agencies taking specific steps to enable standardization with software security?
I think it starts with the acquisition process. Defining, again, going back to software bill of materials, getting clear definitions for what a company is going to acquire and how to report that back out, using the language, using when version A mean, what does that mean? So using our partners with ANS to go get their standards right in the documents and leadership that they have, in making sure all the PEOs and the program managers underneath are using the common framework. So partners with ANS, partnering with cyber policy, make sure we're a standard. CIO, CISO sets the standards for cybersecurity across the department, but we can't do that without the acquisition community and the sustainment community and the operators understanding what all that means.
Excellent. Allan?
So if two people agree, then one of them is irrelevant and doesn't need to be on the panel. So I'm going to try to sort of inject a slightly different perspective on standards. There's a very overused cliche in cybersecurity, but I think it's still very important, which is we're building the plane while flying it. And that means that if we rush to formally standardize things, we may not actually appreciate scale and real-world use cases. There was a very well-intentioned and very nice human from a major FFRDC who, like 4 years ago, rushed to try to take SBOM to international standards organizations. And of course, it went nowhere because SBOM required buy-in from large software manufacturers, startups, the open source community, the security research community, the vulnerability community. And so building that out and figuring out what works and how it scales allows us to say, hey, this is what an SBOM looks like. And this is how we're going to implement it in the executive order today. The trade-off of that kind of innovation, I think, and this is where I'm going to have to sort of say this is Allan's personal opinion, involves moving to a world where we have less onerous compliance-based approaches, good for business, but faster moving guidance. So we say, this year you have to do this much. You got to be this high to ride the internet. Next year, we're going to ratchet that up. And we're going to be transparent, and we're going to be open, and we're going to allow as much feedback. In fact, we have to have feedback from industry. But the trade-off is it's got to be more agile.
Got it. Excellent. An SBOM question, but I'm going to start with industry on this one because this is a good one. There are lots of benefits. Does it also introduce a risk by making the list of ingredients available? And is that a bad thing? Is that something that Google's talking about internally, whether or not disclosure in an SBOM might, whether that's a trade secret or a vulnerability introduction that you'd need to worry about?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think generally speaking, there is some awareness that that is a potential risk, and there are a lot of processes internally for things like vulnerability disclosure. But ultimately, as we've stated previously, there is a meaningful tool here. And so I think it may be helpful just to acknowledge that part of the benefit in creating a tool like SBOM that then leverages the procuring power of government and what that does for the entire ecosystem in terms of cybersecurity. So I have to be careful about dancing into my previous role here, but I think there is some value that it might be helpful to state on that front.
Excellent. Jane, is it similar for Oracle?
I think it presents some risk, but I think this is where you find the government-industry partnership to be valuable, and you have to utilize it to the maximum extent possible. I think we all know that the protections are there, on both sides, but we have to share and we have to trust each other. And if you don't trust, then you can't move forward. And so I think those are the things that we have to work toward.
Excellent. Go ahead, Allan.
So this is a very common question. I sort of think of this as the roadmap to the attacker. Are you going to be giving bad guys a roadmap for how to attack a piece of software? So a couple things. One, there's no requirement today for SBOMs to be public. There are companies that say, let's just do it. There's a cloud platform company called JupyterOne. You go to jupyterone.com/SBOM. They have their live SBOM. So they have an hourly build updated every hour. But not everyone has to, especially not in the IC and in critical infrastructure. Second, it's 2022. We don't just talk about attackers. We threat model, right? So on one level, you've got your advanced adversaries. The idea that an advanced adversary needs an SBOM to go after your product is just laughable, right? Jidra's free, so they can get that information anyway. And anyone who wants to know what's in a product that they care about will find a way to get that product and reverse engineer it. And at the other end, you've got automated attacks. And again, they also don't care about the SBOM because they're just spray and pray. And there, the roadmap is needed by the defender. They need to know what they have on their network, asset management, and then they need to know what's the risk, which is the underlying SBOM.
Continue on the SBOM question, and this one has to do with how it gets rolled out and adopted over time and increasing its usage. There are already, I mean, Janice, you mentioned this earlier, that this is something that companies are already doing with their suppliers and their customers in the private sector, having nothing to do with government, because it's an expectation in some cases. What's the next part of the process to trigger those kind of natural incentives so that there's adoption other than by fiat? How do we incentivize adoption of software bills of material?
So one of the things we need to make it easier and cheaper. How do we do that? Through tooling. Today, even compared to 6 or 9 months ago, generating SBOMs is something that we know how to do fairly well. There are specific tools for different sectors. There's specific tools for different technologies. There's cloud native things. So Docker, which is one of the major cloud platform provisioning for cloud native technology, just announced that one command to produce an SBOM of your container. So that, talk about lowering your costs. And then the next step is going to be how do we consume them? And then the final step, which we're working with the community, although we have to be very careful with our lawyers around this, is how do we put this into easy-to-use contracts? Right? Again, not necessarily the acquisition rules, because the vast majority of contracts are, government's not involved at all, right? How do we make it so that when a manufacturer has 1,000 customers, they just have one set of common-to-use language? And that's something that we'd love to move in and help with. But again, that has to be an industry-led process.
Excellent. All right, this next one's for Janice, although I think Stephanie has an opinion on this too. How do Oracle and the Navy handle software supply chain challenges differently? And I expect, Stephanie, you'll have a similar opinion for Google. But how is it different? What have you noticed since you've moved to the private sector?
So it's definitely different. If I put my government hat back on, we were, and because we'd had an incident anyway, everybody knows we had one. It was more rigorous. Well, how did this happen? Why did it happen? What did you do wrong? Blah, 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 things like that. Then on this side, it's more, okay, it happened. What do we do to mitigate it? How fast can we mitigate it? What's the cost to the customer? What's the cost to us? What do we do to make sure it doesn't happen again? The lessons learned, the industry makes their lessons learned a lot faster. They do them faster than the government. I think it took us in Navy almost a year to figure out lessons learned, the cost impact when we had our incident back in, I think it was 2015. And, it's just a faster process. And so when we talk to the Navy and Marine Corps, when we talk to any of our customers, we talk to them about, here are the things we do internally, maybe, some best practices we have. Maybe we could try to get you all to do those as well. It would make it faster for you, help solve this problem faster. You still get to report out. You still can resolve the issue, but it won't take like it did when I saw it with the Navy. It was a long thing. It was very long.
Stephanie, how about you? What's different, pros and cons?
I think that's a great point. It's something that I've observed as well in terms of just a different pace at which industry is able to iteratively improve and also develop processes and do so in a way that still enables embracing innovation. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've observed, in addition to just the rapidness in terms of learning lessons and changing and developing new processes where necessary, but that doing so while still fostering innovation has been something that I've noticed.
Excellent. This next question is a great one. The responsibility for this problem. In software supply chain, in some cases it's an engineering problem, in some cases it's a product problem, in some cases it's a compliance problem. And there are a lot of different things involved in what we're talking about here. And Mark, I'll kick this one to you in first. When we think about companies and agencies too, where should responsibility reside for supply chain software security? Who's the natural owner of the problem set to make sure that it's being well coordinated?
Oh, one, I'll say my office, the CISA. I'm obviously the natural lead-in. one of the things we're looking at too, another area of interest, is improving how we do risk management across the department and getting to the holy grail of continuous evaluation. Well, if people want to get there and allow the innovation development to deploy out sooner, if you have a continuous authorization, continuous evaluation of the network, you're allowed to go do updates faster, because then you don't need to go through the long paperwork process, because you're just making delta changes to what you already have. And if you know what software is getting updated and patched and the pedigree of that software and what the changes are, then you can go put those software on the networks faster, go get incremental improvements. So from a cybersecurity perspective, I'm interested in doing that. But then I use my partners in ANS, making sure they have the right acquisition framework behind it to go do get the right language, get the right developmental done in those small increments to do it. And then I'll use, and again, in Department of DOT&E, the testing and evaluation. If they have the right testing paradigm behind it, where I can do it again, the incremental testing, I can go confidence back to my customer saying, I know what I'm putting on the network. So I know I'm cyber secure, I know I have the functionality there, and I know it's been tested. If I can do that a lot faster, then we can go roll out the innovations even that much faster. But it's a partnership between all the organizations inside the department involved in rolling that out.
Got it. And another SBOM question. This is a popular topic today. If you had to pick a company that's just doing it right, like a great practice, a best practice company who's building these things effectively, not that you're endorsing them specifically for their software product, just for their SBOM, who would you point to?
That's a fun question. Honorable mention goes to our friends in Mountain View with the SALSA framework. That is something that they have sort of turned over to the open source community, and it's piecing together some existing components. But for the fun, controversial piece, let's go SolarWinds. Talk about an organization that understood the risk and implemented a broad-based set of solutions that actually tackled the approach. Because one of the things, if you look at the SolarWinds attack, is there was no single weak point. Right? There is nothing. I've talked to dozens of vendors that say, my tool could have prevented that. I'm like, possibly, but the attacker had a desired goal. And so if they didn't go there, they would go in there. And so the SolarWinds approach was not to say, let me go after a specific control. It was to say, let me build a development pipeline that actually has validation at every step of the way, from the source, through the development, to the build, following the post-build, to the point where they now have 3 independent pipelines that are housed physically separately with no interconnectivity. And then they compare, going back to when computers in the 1980s had to vote because there were going to be flaws and errors. So they compare the outputs of the different builds to make sure that they're all identical. So if you want to talk about people who get it because they had to stay in business, I like SolarWinds.
Hard knocks. That's often the way. We have time for a wrap-up comment from each of you. We could keep going forever. Awesome questions. But what I'll do is I'll ask everybody just to tell me what's the one thing from this conversation you want to make sure that everybody takes away. If they learn nothing else, make sure you remember this one thing, and we'll go from my left to right. Al?
Well, mine's easy. SBOM. Why would you trust a supplier that couldn't tell you what they were shipping?
Excellent. Mark?
DoD is working to be innovative to go get this done faster, but we still have to be deliberate because there are processes in place, and those processes are in place for certain reasons. So we're using our authorities of guide rails to allow people to innovate, but do it in a measured way.
Excellent.
I would say partnership within the government industry ecosystem and information sharing.
Awesome.
I would reiterate that, but also just touching on something that Allan mentioned associated with companies saying that they have tools that might have caught SolarWinds as an example. I think the point, and Carrie and Jeanette both raised this as well, that we have very capable and persistent adversaries, and things like zero trust and information sharing will continue to be critical even as we improve the security of the software supply chain.
Awesome. Guys, it has been a privilege for me to sit here and ask you questions for an hour. So thank you so much. Please give these guys a round of applause. Appreciate the time.